I noticed that in the beginning, I wasn't being drawn in. But I guess at a certain point, I surrendered to the filmmaker.
And I wonder what you see in Trump's contemporary politics as a culmination of his time with Roy Cohn.
This film is quite stunning. It's quite remarkable. Even before embarking on this project, I was aware that the Chinese Communist Party was very unhappy with how that process unfolded. Well, the soundtrack to a coup d'etat, it resonated with me. Well, actually, it is heartfelt.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anthony Ballas. This is episode 16 of De Facto, and I'm once again joined by Dr. Gerald Horne, Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Dr. Horne, thank you for joining me once again, and welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So today, we're actually going to talk about some films that have recently come out, or they either have come out or they're due to come out in wide release shortly. First up, we have the Danish-Iranian filmmaker Ali Abbasi's The Apprentice, which is essentially a biopic of about Donald Trump and Roy Cohn, which chronicles and dramatizes their friendship and business dealings in the 70s and into the 80s. And then we'll talk about the very interesting soundtrack to a coup d'etat by the Belgian filmmaker Johan Grimonprez, which is a highly stylized documentary, maybe more of like a musical documentary about the geopolitical and cultural context of the US, British, and Belgian-backed coup against and the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in 1961. It's also a film about jazz militancy and,
Mm-hmm.
and musical developments in the art in the 1950s and really into the 60s. And then finally, if we've got time, Dr. Horne, I thought you could share your thoughts on Blitz and Dahomey. Dahomey is not streaming yet, but it's due to come out soon, I think. So anyway, Dr. Horne, let's begin with The Apprentice, if you don't mind. What are some of your general reflections on the film, and what do you see as its importance in 2024 after witnessing Trump's second presidential victory?
Well, as I've said elsewhere, I think the importance of this film rests in no small measure on the point that it presents a more credible explanation for the rise of Donald Trump than many that have been presented by friends on the left, and not to mention liberals and centrists. That is to say, by connecting Trump to Roy Cohn being the late notorious fixer, lawyer, comrade of Senator Joseph McCarthy, a man who has a hand in the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in June 1953, a man featured in the award-winning Angels in America by Tony Kushner, for example. So he's no cipher. He's well known in popular culture and in political culture. But with this film, The Apprentice, connecting him to Trump, it helps to underscore a point that I've been making, which is that a possible explanation for the ascendancy of Donald Trump rests with the Red Scare and the Cold War, which Roy Cohn came to embody. That is to say, that there was a systematic attempt to wreck and undermine left-wing alternatives to neoliberalism or to rank conservatism. And at the end of the day, by 2024, that legacy still haunts us. And so when many voters stream to the polls looking for an alternative to the status quo, they opted for the right-wing alternative to the status quo because the left-wing alternative had been undermined. Now, the problem in part with that particular argument is that those with whom we presumably share a trench, I'm speaking of the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, the AFL-CIO, and other so-called centrist and liberal stalwarts, they did not stand tall during the Red Scare nor the Cold War. I mean, I've written about that at great length. That's what helped to attract me to writing history in the first instance back in the 1980s. And so it becomes rather difficult for those who share a trench with these liberal stalwarts or who look to them for leadership to then point the finger of accusation at them in part. And so that helps to underscore the importance of this film, The Apprentice, which organically connects the pre-existing epic, the Red Scare and the Cold War, with the contemporary epic of Trumpism. And with regard to the acting, I guess that I too am bedazzled by Jeremy Strong. I watched the Succession, the HBO takeoff on the Murdoch family. And I too found him to be a rather compelling actor in that particular series. I find him compelling in this particular series as well. And as a person who actually lived in New York during the time when these events were unfolding in the 1970s and in the 1980s, the movie also struck a chord in that respect as well. So, as used to be said, I'll give 2 thumbs up to The Apprentice. And what is your assessment?
Yeah, I thought that, well, you just mentioned Jeremy Strong's performance as Roy Cohn. I thought it was compelling also. And it made me think of Succession also. His character, Kendall Roy,
Mm-hmm.
he's a little different than Roy Cohn, of course, in many ways. He's a lot younger, for instance, but he's perhaps no less sociopathic, psychopathic, we might say, in his pursuits. And I thought maybe Jeremy Strong's portrayal of Kendall Roy may have lubricated in a way his
Mm-hmm.
performance as Roy Cohn, for all these reasons that you just mentioned. I'm curious. I agree, of course, that this organic link to the Red Scare is sort of a point of mediation between Trump and Cohn is extremely important. And I wonder what you see in Trump's contemporary politics as a culmination of his time with Roy Cohn. I mean, some of it might be obvious to you and to viewers, but what do you see in Trump's politics and the MAGA movement more generally that has really articulated this or realized this organic link that you speak of?
Well, there's the amorality in the
Right.
first instance. You know, Roy Cohn, it's not mentioned in the movie, but one of the phrases which helped to make him notorious is that as a lawyer, he would say, I don't want to know what the law is. I want to know who the judge is, because then he could find a scandal on the judge
Mhm.
and help to rescue his client that way, for example. And obviously, amorality is a calling card for Mr. Trump. And the film makes explicit this approach to scandal. I don't know if I can recall every aspect of it, but it's deny, attack, uh, never admit.
I've got it right here, actually, if you want me.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
He has his 3 axioms, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
Attack, attack, attack. That's 1. 2, admit nothing, deny everything. And 3,
Right.
no matter what happens, never admit defeat. Those are the
Yeah,
3.
plus, as we used to say in St. Louis, Trump sells a lot of wolf tickets. I mean, I was just seeing in the press today that he's threatening the BRICS nations,
Yeah.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. If you dare to stop using the dollar, which they've already moved to do, we're going to slap 100% tariffs on you. I mean, this is just empty.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, as I've also been saying, I think that the so-called allies of the United States have a lot to worry about. Canada in the first place.
Mhm.
I mean, basically, his motto can be reduced to Canada will help the United States be great again, because they're going to continue to cut taxes for the wealthy in the United States and then make up the shortfall by getting Canadians to pay more in terms of tariffs or Canadian exports. And as I'm going to say in interviews this week, uh, all of Canada should be engaged in self-criticism right now, not just the ruling class, which is obvious, but also the left, because I've been very disappointed with the Canadian left in terms of their approach to republicanism with a small r. I mean, I understand the difficulty with accepting King Charles as your head of state, but if they know Canadian history, I dealt with this at length in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown. The Negroes in Canada, they all oppose the republicanism. And this is something that the US left too has not grappled with, which is to say that, as I've said previously, I mean, you can wake the typical US leftists up in the middle of the night and they'll start babbling and prating and prattling about the real and imagined debilities of socialism. They haven't even thought about the actual debilities of republicanism. That is to say, the movement from the divine right of kings to the movement of the divine right, particularly of property men of European descent. And that excludes great swaths of the population. But that's hardly been any discourse in this country. And Canada, being an outside observer, they should have been telling people in the United States this sort of thing. But instead, what you find in the US left, I mean, excuse me, the Canadian left is this sort of praise of 1776, looking longingly to the United States for inspiration. Oh, you don't see that many Canadians moving to the United States. You see a lot of people in the United States moving to Canada. I mean, that should have been a tip-off of some sort. So in any case, I'm sorry for this tangent, but it's been occupying my mind quite a bit with Justin Trudeau groveling in Mar-a-Lago as we speak. It's really shameful, how he's been reduced to crawling on his knees to Florida with probably no satisfaction emerging. And so I think that the aggressiveness of Roy Cohn you see embodied in Donald Trump, the shamelessness of Roy Cohn, which is embodied in those axioms you just cited with regard to roughhousing and manhandling women, not apologizing, and in fact being rather brazen about it. It's just like this slogan that's all over the press right now, that you see in what the press calls the manosphere. I think it's, what is it? Your body, my choice, something like that.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That's Trumpism to a T.
I believe we can attribute to Nick Fuentes, in fact. Right. You speaking of this, you used the term embodiment, and I thought an interesting detail in the film, which I double checked, having not grown up in that era, and apparently it's factually accurate that Roy Cohn was kind of well known for his tan, having his
right
body. He'd make these trips to Mexico and maintain his tan and whatnot. And that's one of those cartoonish details we often attribute to Trump. So maybe even in more ways than just morality and politics, Trump is reflected in Trump's own embodiment. You just mentioned Canada as this outside observer. I think that's interesting. In terms of this film, we have a Danish-Iranian filmmaker into this biography of Trump, and Sebastian Stan, who does I think an incredible job playing Trump, which has to be a difficult task for any actor. It's a difficult task for a viewer, I think, often to view Trump. But Sebastian Stan does an incredible job, really, with his mannerisms and the pace and cadence and everything. But as my mother observed, it might take an outside observer to really nail Trump in this way and really depict him in an accurate light. I'm thinking of these other impersonations you oftentimes find in satire. We typically reduce Trump to satire when he's depicted on SNL and things of that nature. But this film there's a little satire, but mostly it's just a very realistic depiction that's quite disturbing. So I wonder your thoughts on the realism of the film and having an outside observer actually produce this depiction.
Well, from interviews, I gleaned the point that Sebastian Stan's, he begins his depiction of Trump as being rather soft-spoken. And then he says, as the plot evolves, that is dispensed with. And in retrospect, I guess I can see that, although I can't say that I was noticing it during the course of the performance. Although one of the things I did notice during the course of the performance is how, of course, Trump uses his hands. That becomes, and that of course is something that many actors use in order to define a character. I recall reading interviews with Denzel Washington, where he says that in terms of trying to capture the essence of a character he's depicting, he oftentimes uses his hands to do so. And since Trump is notorious for doing so, that becomes obviously something for Mr. Stans to pick up on. And another detail about Roy Cohn that we should not allow to go unmentioned is, of course, that he's this notorious closeted gay man and denies his sexual orientation. And apparently, and this comes from Angels in America, the Tony Kushner project as well, that he's an early victim, so to speak, of HIV/AIDS. And of course, he's portrayed in the movie engaged in various sorts of sexual encounters. I should also say that you were mentioning the fact that Mr. Cohn is changing his appearance with tanning. I found it very difficult to watch the scenes of Mr. Trump getting these operations on his scalp.
Mm-hmm.
And if I recall as well, a tummy tuck as well. It was very difficult for me to watch. Maybe I'm squeamish. I don't know, but it was a bit much for me.
Right. I agree. Very difficult. That's actually spoiler alert to everyone watching. That's the end of the film. You see Trump getting this plastic surgery, which he will, of course, in very Cohn-like fashion, deny to the press. Um, Speaking of the press, there's this Cohn teaches Trump not only to wield power, to disregard moral norms and so, that sort of thing, but also to manipulate the media, which is a big point of the film. He actually has this advice for Trump. It's quite explicit. You create your own reality, he tells him.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is a malleable thing, and tells him to spread the news like it's already happened. And I found this, to be extremely telling, and just in terms of how Trump operates and how the MAGA movement operates more generally. This is where we get the narrative of alternative facts, I think, and that sort of thing. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the and having lived through that era, the idea of media manipulation and some of these figures, these figures like Cohn and et cetera.
Well, needless to say, the press was quite willing to be manipulated, particularly the New York Post. It's during that era, if I'm not mistaken, that the Australian-born billionaire Rupert Murdoch buys this tabloid. And I'm old enough to recall when the New York Post was much more respectable during the time when New York had a number of newspapers. It was under the ownership of Dorothy Schiff, for example, Schiff. Which, by the way, I wonder if she's related to Adam Schiff, the recently elected senator from California. But in any case, Trump and the New York Post developed this symbiotic relationship, particularly page 6, which is their scandal sheet. And then, of course, Trump is notorious. I don't think this is depicted in the movie for calling the press and acting like he's a spokesperson for Trump, and then spreading lies like Madonna is very much interested in Donald Trump or something to that effect, for example. So Obviously, this sort of manipulation of the press continues to this very day. I'll never forget. So a few weeks ago, I happened to be watching Morning Joe, and Joe Scarborough and Miko Brzezinski are browbeating Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, uh, who, of course, has these anti-Trump books out, because Woodward won't go far enough in terms of the denunciation of Trump, in their humble opinion. Then right after the election, who shows up in Mar-a-Lago bending the knee and asking for forgiveness but Mika and Joe? I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, this is almost like the sequel to the Apprentice movie. I mean, it's really shameful and shameless.
Right, right. Yeah, the about face of people like Morning Joe, Joe Scarborough, maybe in retrospect, not surprising, but shameless, as you put it, certainly. Now, I know that some folks in our audience and perhaps others, given the sort of Trump, dominated news cycle, um, may not rush out to watch this film for various reasons.
I
Maybe
understand wholly.
right. But I think, as you've been discussing, there's an importance to this film. And beyond just the this a representation of a president elect who was just elected, right? But also the historical and organic link to Cohn and the Red Scare and so forth, which is, that's a topic we don't really touch on in in popular sources in the United States, certainly. So I think it's an important film for people who are otherwise even disgusted by Trump to view. And I wonder, I mean, you gave it two thumbs up already, but what would you have to say to those folks out there who aren't really so quick, won't be so quick to rush out and see it?
Well, I would understand why people don't want to pay money to see a film, but as you know, I don't have to tell you that in the United States, there are ways to see films without paying money.
For
Spoiler.
now, right?
Sorry?
For now, at least.
Exactly. So I would say it's a very interesting historical artifact, but I have to underscore this point, which is that in connecting Trumpism to the pre-existing epic, as embodied by Roy Cohn, the Red Scare of the Cold War, it serves a very useful purpose. As I said, it soars far beyond explanations offered by even some of our friends on the left in terms of explaining this remarkable political ascendancy. And so, for that reason alone, I think the film is worth seeing, and certainly uh, in terms of depicting imperial decadence, for example, in terms of some of the scenes from the Roy Cohn mansion, in terms of depicting racism as reflected in the early scenes where Trump is collecting rent money from harassed and beleaguered tenants, for example. Those are very useful depictions of class tensions, to put it mildly, uh, erupting on the silver screen. And so, to that extent, I think that the film is a very useful document.
Mhm.
In addition to being entertaining, in addition to being graced with credible performances by actors.
Mhm. Here, here. Yeah, fully agree with that appraisal. Shall we move on to soundtrack to a coup d'etat?
Oh, sure.
Okay. So this film, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this film in particular, especially given that you've written so extensively on anti-colonial movements in the
Mm-hmm.
African continent, Pan-Africanism and the Cold War, and as well as jazz music. And so I just wonder initially here, what was some of your initial reflections after viewing this film?
Well, soundtrack to a coup d'etat, it resonated with me. I mean, as you've mentioned, I've written on Max Roach, the drummer, in my book Jazz and Justice, and his former spouse, then known as Abby Lincoln. I wrote in that, oh, good. I wrote in that book about Louis Armstrong, who was a major character. I wrote about Dizzy Gillespie, a major character. And so the film, just to back up for a moment, it's a portrayal of events in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, larger in territory than Western Europe, replete with natural resources, including coltan, which is essential for mobile phones. In fact, the filmmakers have a few references to contemporary events because there are many nations that could claim this ignominious crown of being beleaguered, terribly exploited, but the DRC has to be in the top 5, and particularly Eastern Congo, for example, and there are scenes from contemporary Eastern Congo, albeit fleetingly, in this particular film. And so the film unfolds for the most part in the late 1960s, late 1960, 1960 being the year of Africa. A lot of the film takes place in the context of the United Nations with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev denouncing the North Atlantic nations for backing colonialism, not only in Congo, but in Africa in general. What I found impressive about this film is that in some ways it's like a book because the filmmaker has the equivalent of footnotes with regard to scenes. I was thinking that someone could easily go back and watch this film and write down all the sources and write a book accompanying this film. It wouldn't surprise me if the filmmaker were to do that. And if he doesn't do it, someone else should do it. And the footage is quite remarkable that he's able to dig up, not only from the United Nations, but from Congo itself, from Belgium, for example. And the final scene, or one of the final scenes, when these Black Americans invade the General Assembly in protest against the assassination of Lumumba, January 1961. And we knew in advance, as represented in the memoir by the former CIA station chief, Larry Devlin, who's interviewed in the film. He admits in his memoir the complicity of Washington in the assassination. And so these Black Americans, they invade the General Assembly in protests, get into fistfights with security as the United Nations ambassador looks on. One detail which he neglects, but which is in my book on Ben Davis, Black Liberation, Red Scare, is that if the Black power advocates involved in that importantly profound protest want to engage in self-criticism, one of the self-criticisms could be that they banned Ben Davis from their protests. They banned a Black communist, I guess because he was a communist, which was very ironic since Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union was the one literally and figuratively banging the rostrum in protests. And so the Black protesters were in an objective alliance with Khrushchev. And so in that context, banning Ben Davis doesn't make sense, not to mention the ideological basis for banning Ben Davis. I understand why the filmmaker might not mention that detail because it could disrupt the narrative flow, for example. But in any case, I must say that this film is quite stunning. It's quite remarkable. It's quite well done. And I usually don't see films twice, but I might make an exception for this because it's so informative. And I remember I saw it in Manhattan at the Film Forum, and I think it's still at the Film Forum, but I'm not mistaken, although I'm sure you can find it streaming somewhere.
Yeah, I want to tell our audience that on Plex, the app Plex,
Okay.
and sign up for it.
Okay. It's not necessarily linear. to begin with. And I noticed that in the beginning, I wasn't being drawn in. But I guess at a certain point, I surrendered to the filmmaker and let myself be drawn in, and in which case I was rewarded amply.
Hmm. Yeah, part of that might have to do with the style.
Mm,
It's hard to kind of there's no seamless way in which the audience is incorporated into this film because right from the beginning you have footnotes, quotations, Abby Lincoln singing from the Freedom Now suite, um, and I think some depictions of Khrushchev um, beating his beating
mm,
arms on the podium at the UN's Security Council. And so it's really a collision of different visual and sonic elements that are kind of disjointed at first, and then they kind of start streamlining as you get used to it, perhaps. And I thought that was a really interesting stylistic choice. I even viewed it as perhaps even a stylistic antidote to the sort of Ken Burns effect that you
mm,
often find in some of his documentaries, with the series of images that we kind of panning through these still shots.
mm,
That can kind of lull the audience in a way that this film keeps you perhaps more awake and active as an audience. That's just my own appraisal.
mm,
So, and just on the point of banning Ben Davis, I wonder if some of that had to do with the fact that at one point jazz music was banned in the Soviet Union,
mm,
and Khrushchev didn't have very nice things to say about jazz music either.
mm.
There's some contradictions even in his politics, I guess you could say, which is to be expected. Any thoughts on that before we move on?
Well, Khrushchev has come in for his share of criticism. I mean, for example, right now, with this crisis in Ukraine, many analysts have suggested we've returned to October 1962 and the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis, when Khrushchev and the Soviet Communist Party put defensive missiles on the island in Cuba as a response to the Bay of Pigs invasion of April 1961, whereby the United States and certain Cuban and Cuban American mercenaries seek to topple the infant Fidel Castro regime. And Khrushchev has been criticized, including by the Cubans, by the way, for withdrawing the missiles unilaterally. And then the United States withdraws missiles from Turkey that are aimed at the Soviet Union. For whatever reason, that doesn't get as much publicity. I don't know if that was part of the deal or not. And that was one of the many factors leading to his ouster as head of the Soviet Communist Party a few years later, because the Chinese did not necessarily appreciate what happened then. And as I said, the Cubans were unhappy as well, just like the Chinese were very unhappy with the 1956 speech that Khrushchev gives upbraiding his predecessor, Joseph Stalin, which was a real publicity coup for the North Atlantic powers. Quite a bit has been written about this. This is fresh on my mind because I'm embarking on a project on U.S.-Chinese relations. And even before embarking on this project, I was aware that the Chinese Communist Party was very unhappy with how that process unfolded. And then subsequent historians like Domenico Losurdo, for example, and I know the guy, he's in New Jersey, who writes like Losurdo, have questioned the entire Khrushchev report from 1956. And then, of course, 1956 is also the year of the revolt in Hungary, the Suez Crisis, with Britain, France, and Israel attacking Nasser's Egypt, a real turning point in the history of the region, a turning point in world history. So, with regard to stability, during a very tumultuous time, Khrushchev has come in for a share of criticism. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, I actually wanted to read a short passage from your book, Jazz and Justice, where you quote um, Max Roach. So this is from page 257 going on to 258. You write, Max Roach proudly asserts proudly that he and his spouse, Abby Lincoln, were, quote, heavily involved in the civil rights movement. This was not simply altruism either. He said, quote, I had a rough period with major record labels, unquote, which soured him further, engendering militancy. Quote, it's like gold mines. We're material, akin to gold and diamonds, and they go into South Africa they go into South Africa, they take it and process it and sell it, and they make billions, leaving crumbs for the actual creators of wealth. Moving on, uh, Roach's musical response to the Freedom Now was the Freedom Now suite, a militant musical intervention that he recalls playing at the NAACP convention in Philadelphia almost 60 years ago. It was composed, and the percussionist, quote, said the percussionist, to celebrate the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. The triptych section grew out of a statement of Marcus Garvey's, which actually linked the civil rights movement with the liberation struggles in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So I'm curious about this and this sort of internationalism and the political militancy of some of these jazz performers. And I was just curious in terms of cultural production today, we don't really see the same kind of political militancy in popular music, or even in unpopular music, you might say. We don't really see the same type of internationalism embedded in the cultural production. I mean, we have, for instance, Macklemore, the rapper, had a couple of tunes um, responding to Israel's genocidal campaign in
Mhm.
Gaza and the student movement also. And I just wonder what your thoughts on why, if you agree that we don't really see the same kind of cultural production in terms of an international militancy in music, for instance, and why we don't see that today.
Well, I think that the moment helps to explain the musicians. That is to say, in the period in which Max Roach was composing the Freedom Now suite, you had Africa on the March, recall the Year of Africa, 1963. Excuse me, the Year of Africa, 1960, then coupled with 1963, December, when Kenya comes to independence and a passel of other African nations after mass revolts like the so-called Mau Mau revolt that led to Jomo Kenyatta being the first leader of independent Kenya in 1963, and of course compelled the United States in response to try to woo Kenyan youth, which leads to Barack Obama Sr. getting a scholarship to the University of Hawaii. And as they say, the rest is history, not to mention all of the anti-Jim Crow protests. And this is propelling the musicians. And there was an article in the New York Times just the other day about how campuses have cracked down successfully on the pro-Palestinian protests and have squashed them to a certain degree. And given that factor, it becomes more difficult and more problematic for artists, cultural creators to take advantage of a historical moment or to take advantage of a blossoming movement when the movement does not seem to be blossoming. So I think it's all explicable, but at the same time, I remain optimistic that the United States I see is the equivalent of a pressure cooker, and the lid is on the pressure cooker, but the pressure is building. And so what generally happens in that situation is that the lid is blown off, protest erupts because there's so much to protest about, both domestically and globally, and that moment then will help to propel musicians like today's Max Roach, because of course he passed away a few years ago.
Oh, good. I see what you mean. And you did mention earlier in this interview BRICS nations as a
Mhm.
sort of counterforce, counter hegemony to U.S. imperialism, to the dominance of the U.S. dollar, and so forth. And I wonder if that sort of movement is enough to engender that sort of shift in cultural production. As yet, I don't think we've seen it, but maybe that's forthcoming. We'll see.
Well, I think another alternative to the rather optimistic scenario that I just sketched is a pessimistic scenario whereby Mr. Trump imposes these tariffs, people complaining about inflation in 2023, 2024. Well, they ain't seen nothing when it comes to what might be the eventual result of the Trump tariffs, that these rather coarse sayings like your body, my choice is reflected in widespread sexual harassment, sexual abuse, police forces being unleashed against the Black community in particular. And that is another plausible scenario for what we will be facing going forward. And with regard to the 75 million strong Trump base, there's no guarantee that they will see the light, to put it mildly. Actually, the analogy might be a person having a blemish on their face and they apply a cream that they think is eradicating the blemish, but it's actually causing the blemish to grow. So they keep applying more cream and the blemish keeps growing. And so, in other words, they'll double down on their support for Trumpism as the antidote to these proliferating problems. But the antidote does not work. It's worsening and exacerbating the crisis. And there you have a nation in a tailspin. That's another possible scenario for this country.
Right. Is this your new take on the Donald Rumsfeld? I think it's Donald Rumsfeld. If you want to solve a problem, expand it or make it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the U.S. mantra, in fact. I mean, particularly with regard to foreign policy. I mean, I won't go off on a tangent in that direction, though.
Now, I didn't get to see Dahomey because it was unfortunately not streaming. I don't think it's premiered yet in wide release, at least. So I wonder if you, having seen it at the film festival recently, if you have any thoughts on it that you'd like to share with our audience.
Well, as I told you, I'm reading this book now, Africa's Struggle for Its Art, History of a Post-Colonial Defeat by Savoy. And of course, Dahomey deals with the repatriation of art and artifacts looted from what is now Benin, then Dahomey in the late 19th century. And the film depicts the course of returning this artwork to Benin and features discourse by West Africans about the return of the art. And I think seeing that film inspired me to pick up this book. And on page Roman numeral 6 of the preface, it reads, and I quote, "Almost all of Africa's ancient artistic heritage is now preserved in European countries, in the United Kingdom, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Vienna, and Belgium. The British Museum alone has 69,000 objects in its inventory from African countries south of the Sahara. The Weltmuseum in Vienna has 37,000. The Royal Museum for Central Africa in Belgium has 180,000. This museum in the Netherlands has 66,000. Interestingly, in the United States, it's a piker in this regard. 20,000 at the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, 13,000 at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., 4,000 at the Brooklyn Museum in New York. Taken together, U.S. museums hold fewer African objects in the African Heritage Department of the Jacques Chirac Museum alone in France. So it's Europe that's the culprit. And so this book is depicting what the film Dahomey represents. And I saw Dahomey right after I saw Sound of a coup d'etat. Oh, excuse me, soundtrack of a coup d'etat. And I think to a certain extent, soundtrack of a coup d'etat sort of distorted my cinematic palette. In other words, it was so comprehensive, so detailed, so creative that seeing this second film, Dahomey, I think distorted my perception because it's a rather straightforward documentary. I mean, the filmmaker just basically turns his camera or her camera on packing up the artifacts in France and then unpacking them in Benin, and then students and others commenting upon what happened. So there's not that much historical context even. But having said that, I found it to be very informative. I'm glad I saw it. And as I said, it inspired me to pick up this book.
That sounds like an endorsement to me. So,
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Dahomey, and not to mention the fact that at least in this country, there's not that many films
right.
being shown that depicts life in this West African nation, for example, from which many Black Americans have roots in that part of Africa, for example. So for that reason alone, it's worth screening.
And then there's the film Blitz, which came out, which I was not able to see, but I know you were able to view it. I wonder if you have any thoughts on Blitz that you might want to share.
So Blitz takes place in World War II London. Uh, the bombing of London and that part of England. It reminds me of a Spielberg film, Empire of the Sun, which deals with a youth trying to escape the Japanese bombing of China during the same period. This time, it's a Black youth who is escaping the bombing. It's sort of, as many critics have pointed out, it's reminiscent of Charles Dickens in terms of what this youth is enduring. So a picaresque journey. I have to say I'm a fan of Steve McQueen, the Black British director, writer of this epic. I marvel at his ability to raise these mega budgets to put on these blockbuster films that's financed by Apple. You can now see it on Apple TV. You might recall Steve McQueen from 12 Years a Slave, which won an Oscar, or another film that he did with Viola Davis, the Black woman actor, Widows, filmed in Chicago. I really thought that was an important cinematic work. After seeing Blitz, I screened his documentary, Occupied City, which deals with his new hometown, Amsterdam, and the German occupation of Amsterdam. It's documentary. It's very comprehensive. Somebody told me, was it you, that there's a 36-hour version of this film?
Maybe it was Ryan. I don't think it was me.
Oh, okay. I only saw 4 hours.
Oh, wow.
I find it hard to believe that he put out a 30. Well, anyway, that's somebody told me that. It's easy enough to ask Dr. Google if that's accurate. But I appreciate Steve McQueen's work. And of course, Linton Kwesi Johnson, who is a celebrated figure, sort of the Gil Scott-Heron of Black Britain. He has a small role in this film, which to me is virtually worth the price of admission.
Oh, good. Okay, good. Yeah, I'll have to certainly make sure that I screen that one.
Mhm.
So, just in closing here, Dr. Horne, thank you so much for these wonderful analyses on these set of films that have come out or are coming out. We should probably close by asking what projects you've got in store. I know that I saw recently announced that on International, you and TO Paris have a new work that's announced, African Americans and a New History of the United States of America.
Right.
And then you've got another book due out in 2025, I think, on slavery in Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. Any
And so it's interesting. The first book that you mentioned, it's sort of the introduction of a number of books that I've written chronologically from the 16th century to the present. And another title for this book could be From Slavery to Socialism, African Americans in the New History of the United States of America. Because that's really what the book is about. About half the book is about slavery and the struggle against slavery, and the other half is about the struggle for socialism, featuring people like Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Ferdinand Smith, William Patterson, etc. And the DC book, it'll be out in a few months. So I'm going to write in the next few months this next book, which is it's the final. I think it'll be the final part of a trilogy. The Counter-Revolution of 1893, obviously a follow-on from the Counter-Revolution of 1776, the Counter-Revolution of 1836, the Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup and the roots of U.S. imperialism in the Asia-Pacific region. So it's mostly dealing with Hawaii, although there's a lot on Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, Thailand, Indochina, Malaysia, Philippines, of course, since that's
right.
it's along with Hawaii, that's more or less the centerpiece
Mhm.
of this work. And then after a couple trips, I'm going to write this book, maybe by the end of next year. I'm still toying with the title, but it'll probably be something like Slavery and White Supremacy in Africa with a question mark. The roots of U.S. imperialism in what I call Greater Egypt and Ethiopia. And so, in other words, it's dealing, I mean, to cite one episode amongst many, after the U.S. Civil War, 1865, you have all these Confederate soldiers who decamp to Egypt to help the Egyptian leaders in their conflict, which stretches back centuries, with Ethiopia, for example. They invade Ethiopia. They're also helping to subdue Sudan to the south, for example. And there's quite a bit in this book also on not only East Africa, stretching down to Zanzibar, but also what is now popularly referred to as West Asia, that is to say, historic Palestine, stretching east to Iran, for example. So it's a sprawling project. And just this month, November 2024, I've started these other projects. Slavery in Mississippi. I've already discarded my hypothesis, which is that Nina Simone could make a song, Mississippi Goddamn, because as opposed to Alabama Goddamn or Texas Goddamn, because my hypothesis was Mississippi was so horrible because of the violence needed to uproot the Choctaw and the Chickasaw, then bled over into slavery. But I think it has more to do with the fact that you have a Black majority. Well, for the longest, you had a Black majority in Mississippi. And in order to keep the Negroes in line, you had to unleash a tidal wave of violence, which makes Mississippi quite remarkable. And we should not see it as coincidental, as the historians like to say, that the leader of the so-called Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis, was a Mississippian, for example. And another project is the Black exile to British Columbia. That's also, I should say, my roots are in Mississippi. My parents are from Mississippi. That's one of the reasons I'm tackling this subject. And the exile to British Columbia project, because in case things continue to go south, I may be going to the Canadian authorities, assuming that society doesn't collapse under the weight of Trump tariffs, and saying, hey, you people should give me the equivalent of a green card. I'm helping to write your history. And then the U.S. and China, because obviously one of the most important events of the last half millennium is the rise of China. And I was around when that whole plot was unfolding. Although, of course, like any other history book, I'm going to do a lot of archival work. But the archival work will be shaped and influenced by what I was witnessing, what I was watching, and what I was seeing. So those are my current projects.
Well, that ought to keep you occupied for a while. And
I think so. I think so.
and of course, we're always very excited to hear what you have lined up. It keeps us excited for the future. It's in such dark times that we're facing. Well, anyway, Dr. Horne, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, this evening. Look forward to seeing you again soon, maybe on your second book on Hawaii. The name's escaping me.
Oh yeah, Fighting in Paradise.
Paradise, yeah. Maybe we can meet in a few weeks and discuss that.
Oh yeah. I'm going to Hawaii in a few days, and so the archipelago will be fresh in my mind. So
Good.
I'll be happy to talk about it.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thanks again. Always great talking to you.
Thank you for inviting me. As a matter of fact, this is something that is very painful. My sister once threw out all my baseball cards, which would be worth tens of thousands of dollars now.
Oh my God. No.
Baseball cards from the 1950s.
Ah, Hank Bauer, Mickey Mantle. What?
All of the above.
Oh,
Yeah, I know. It's very painful. I mean, it's not so much the money. It's just that. Well, actually, it is hard for money. Well, I should get this book. Hold on. It's a good book.
I just bought that today.
Is that right? Yeah, it's good. I mean, it doesn't. I'm reading this along with Adam Schatz's book on Frantz Fanon, and so Schatz is a very smooth writer, and you can just sort of glide through it. So this is translated from German, and so you can't glide through it. I mean, it's a very bumpy ride.